Hi, you're watching TelecomTV. We're on tour in Phoenix in Arizona at ETSI NFV number 8. And I'm talking with John Healy, General Manager at the SDN Division at Intel Corporation. John, good to see you.
Good to see you too, Mark.
I'm a Brit, you're an Irishman. We're in the desert and it's cold.
It's cool this time of year.
It is, isn't it? But then it's November and it's cold in here.
Yeah.
But we'll do our manful best to get through it. Important meeting this, a milestone meeting this, John, because things are changing. We're moving within NFV from Phase One to Phase Two. I'd like to start, obviously, by talking about Phase One. What do you make of it? What do you think was achieved? Were your perceptions correct in what was going to happen? And were your expectations met, or were they even exceeded?
I think they were exceeded. When this effort began, a lot of it was visionary. A lot of it was, what could be possible. I think the momentum that was created, if the last ETSI event was anything to go by, the numbers of partners and member companies that have joined the effort is pretty staggering, given its timeline. And the definition of use cases, the formalising of the term NFV, all occurred as a result of this. It's become an industry term now. It's well understood. I think in terms of expectations, I think it set out the agenda. It mobilised an industry around a set of problem statements and opportunities that can go and address those. The definition of the use cases has set the right kind of proof of concept work, which is setting the technology innovation agenda. So I think that's all achieved. A lot more work to be done, but in terms of a first phase, I think all of the members can be very proud of what was achieved so far. Now we move into the more normative phase of turning that good work into a set of standards, specifications, and the more normative form of setting the interfaces for the openness and the interoperability that has to occur to really implement these solutions now, the development and delivery of solutions to meet the need.
NFV burst onto the scene very, very quickly as a concept, and very quickly became apparent that its potential was enormous for changing the network as we know it all over the planet. You've talked about the upside. What about the downside? Were there any disappointments you experienced? Were there any intractable problems raised that you haven't yet managed to solve?
There are several challenges ahead, which is not surprising. It's a pretty profound change in the way networks have been built. The degree of openness promised, the flexibility of concepts like virtualization, are well proven in an environment where they're supporting application processing and application kinds of workloads in the data center in the world of IT. Moving that into networking is a pretty profound change. It changes a lot of the parameters by which networks have been built, the way they've been implemented and the way they've been operated. So as a result of that, there are quite a number of challenges to be overcome. Am I disappointed? No, I don't think so, but I think that we've understood them to a greater degree. The challenge now is to make sure that the momentum can be maintained and focused on resolving them. These are not all technical problems, although there are technical challenges. But engineering problems are fun for this industry. It's a very engineering-centric industry. I'm not concerned about the industry finding ways to overcome engineering problems, albeit I don't want to diminish the work that needs to happen. There is challenge around the business model, the implementation and what I call operationalizing of NFV concepts, because it has both cultural impacts on the way network operations teams have operated. It has business impacts on whom the vendors and partners are and how they will collaborate together to bring solutions to market. And it has long-term sustaining impacts as to how different sizes and types of suppliers in a value chain can build meaningful businesses for themselves and sustain those over time. That all has to work itself through the standard definition work that's happening through the ETSI effort, how the supply and servicing can come from things like the Open Platform for NFV and the definition of what's required there, and how open source components can be aggregated into real solutions and delivered as commercial value. All of these are challenges that lie ahead that have to be resolved for us to achieve that longer term goal that we set ourselves when we went down this path.
Part of the settlement of those challenges is, of course, going to be looked at and taken on in Phase 2, which starts today. Phase 2 is going to be finalised and ratified at this very meeting, this 3-day meeting, which starts this morning. What are your hopes and expectations of this next phase?
That we'll come to clear definitions around what the interfaces need to be. The open interfaces that will enable multi-vendor interoperability. We've used that term quite a bit since the beginning of Phase 1, but multi-vendor interoperability truly means that you can work with multiple vendors, interoperate the solutions that each of them provide, and ensure that what you deliver and what you implement is a workable and sustainable solution at the end. That has to happen. Equally, I think through this phase, the numbers of new use cases will emerge as we look at different ways of applying these technologies to, in some cases, use cases that weren't defined or considered to be very much telco-centric, maybe more enterprise-centric. But there's a wave of interest across other market communities, whether they're cloud vendors with networking, enterprises who want to take advantage of these technologies in their network, in addition to what the telecommunications market will do. They'll present new use cases that need to be accommodated and then resolved and supported. And I think the last of those will be the need to continue to grow and sustain a very vibrant, burgeoning ecosystem of vendors that are collaborating together and working sympathetically to build solutions that can be deployed.
There are, as I understand it, John, 38 different pieces, bits, subjects to be discussed and to be debated and to be prioritised and etched into stone, as it were, over the next 3 days. It's a tall order. Do you see that happening? I
think there's the willingness is there for that to occur. I think the work groups are well established. It's the right approach to drive it, and I think there's a lot of potential for that to be achieved over the next number of days. I mean, that's the goal.
There's a large number of partner announcements being made at the event, and it's obviously part of the sort of the fulfilment part of the industry as we move from theory to practice and reality. Can you talk to us about that?
Well, some of them have happened in the recent weeks, everything from SDN World Congress through to the different companies' own business and marketing activities. What's exciting about that is that it's showing the industry from a fulfillment perspective stepping up. So we've seen companies announce starter kits for NFV that Dell announced, and HP's Helion program, bringing solutions to market that are prescribed to the use cases defined in phase one, and bring together a lot of the technologies we've been working with them on, like optimizations around different processing capabilities, data plane processing as an example, what we've embedded into our platform when we announced our own open networking platform. For server, which aggregates our assets together and brings them as a reference design or reference platform to the industry. What's exciting is that our partners are picking up those reference designs and then bringing product to market and announcing it as a commercial implementation based on those technologies and optimizations. That's a critical phase, has to happen so that we have the target platforms for the industry to bring use cases, characterize workloads, implementations, and then bring them out and deploy them as solutions in their networks.
Interestingly, you now have 37 operator members of the group. They must have quite a profound influence. That's a very representative sample of some major players around the world.
Yeah.
What kind of an impact are they having on the vendors?
I think it's evident by the sorts of announcements that are coming. I actually walk it right back to the beginning of the phase one of this effort, which was born out of a desire by network operators to have the ability to take these IT-centric, standard high-volume service-centric technologies and deploy them in their network. They were, if you like, exercising their demand at the top of the value chain to say, hey, this is what I need to have. I need the industry to respond. How do I best create gravity around the desire and momentum around our needs? And phase one was born out of that need, and the technology providers, the vendor community, have responded. Now, having that breadth of participation is critically important to maintain the momentum. It's like spinning a big flywheel. Now you have more momentum and more force to drive that flywheel to keep it moving. And so the end user community or customer community that makes up the network operators is a critical component of that, and having a significant mass of those participating and contributing is key.
Can we move back to the standardization part for a moment, John, if we could? There seem to be now, me looking from the outside, but knowing the industry pretty well, having spoken to you and others many times before, do you think there's an element of standards bodies jumping on the bandwagon now that they see NFV and SDN going in the right direction, becoming real? Because there have been the pioneers, and the old story is the pioneers get the arrows and the settlers get the land, which is particularly appropriate for here, of course. But do you think there is that element that there are now people saying, I can make money from this, I'm jumping on it? Whereas you've had the stalwarts who've been in from the start, who've pushed it through and got so far.
I better watch out for the arrows. I think there's an element of truth to that. There's an interesting dynamic occurring around standardization and openness. And you could argue they are almost two sides of a coin, where standardization is typically slower, looks for common denominators and unanimous sort of support for a direction, whereas openness is sort of, the Wild West, to use your coin in some respects, in that you have multiple contributors, no real standardization necessarily, but contributors and a rapid cycle of innovation, and in some cases can lead to default standard just through adoption, volume of adoption. What's happened, I think, and you're right, there are a lot of standards groups now and standards bodies who have recognized that SDN and NFV together are a pretty significant unstoppable force for networking. And as a consequence, they should have some activity underway in that vein. That's a good thing in the sense that there's a significant amount of attention. It presents some challenge, I think, in that there are distractions, can be. And certainly there's an element of perhaps participation in this activity because it has gained so much notoriety. What I think lies ahead for the industry is the parsing of what's appropriate in each different standards effort. You think about orchestration and control, and there are both standardization bodies and industry forums and industry groups participating there. You think of things like Open Daylight and of course what's happening in OpenStack, just to name two. The parsing of effort amongst the most appropriate ones, and then the sharing of effort such that you take advantage of what's achieved in one and deploy it and utilize it in another. Duplication of effort will be bad for the industry, and bifurcate effort, create forks in the road which are unnecessary. Now, in addition to that, I think that some of the standards efforts need to evolve, quite honestly, to represent and understand what openness can produce, particularly open source, as on a path to open platforms and open solutions, and then realize that some of the pace of change that occurs there is appropriate for the requirement that the industry has, and that standardization as a process needs to catch up with that. I think that has to happen as well. But it's so to answer your kind of question directly, yeah, there's certainly more interest, and some of it is possibly opportunistic participation, but there is opportunity amongst all those groups to try to parse the effort and really allow different components to be managed through their own individual processes and then aggregate them together. I think the open platform for NFV aspires to move that direction, while it brings an open source distribution to market that then needs to be commercialized. There are several components it can leverage from that will already exist in the open source community.
You brought me brilliantly to my last question, John. I'm just going to turn this over so I can read it properly. But you mentioned OPNFV. Now, OPNFV is going to produce open source code. It's the Linux initiative,
right?
And that's going to enable the realization of NFV solutions all over the place. How do you see that advancing? Who's going to contribute, and how? And will all that feed back in due course in a feedback loop and mechanism back into ETSI? Yeah,
that's the intent. The intent is if you take use cases that are defined as ways as implementations that are desired. Open Platform for NFV, or OPNFV, creates that distribution of software components that are integrated together, open source components, and becomes a distribution under the Linux Foundation project. And then that is the gold standard from which commercial offerings can be developed, taking advantage of its openness, the pace of innovation that's created around an open project of that nature. The participants will be everything from the members who have formally joined the effort, plus the broader community that can participate under that project. And so multiple different sources can provide inputs to it that then become part of that standard distribution and release. And so it feeds back to the fulfillment of the specifications that are coming from the ETSI effort. So you see it like a positive virtuous cycle of standardization, which to support use case implementations, prescribing the open interfaces for multi-vendor interoperability, and then the open platform for NFV as, if you like, a phase in the implementation cycle that brings components together and presents a distribution that can then be utilized to implement the actual solutions. So it's starting to create that cycle of, and to what I spoke of earlier, the standardization effort on one side and the open source contribution to that from a fulfillment perspective on the other.
John Healy, good to talk to you again. You too. Thanks very much indeed.
Pleasure.